I'm delighted to be joined today by Beth Thomas and Michelle Berners-Price, both partners in our Global Mobility Services team. And they're going to be talking to me about the VEX, a very interesting topic of remote working. So maybe, Beth, if I start with you. The last few weeks, we've seen a bit of a rash of particularly CEOs demanding that their employees come back to the office and saying that we can't do proper work unless we're back in the office. Does that mean that the whole remote working trend is over and we're going back to how it was before?
Well, for sure, we're seeing an increase in the tension, I guess, between senior execs wanting the comfort of bricks and mortar in the office and employees who think they can do their jobs perfectly effectively remotely. What COVID has taught us is that those remote working models have just changed. They're different now. So we're seeing everything from 4-day working weeks right through to 100% international remote working. And I don't think that's going to revert to bricks and mortar anytime soon. It is true that those voices are quite loud about the benefits of traditional working models, and it's also true that we're seeing perhaps an evolution or a shift in focus away from short-term international remote working, so the workations, the Bali holiday villas that we've seen in the press recently, a shift towards long-term international remote working. We are seeing more and more companies, not less companies, look to long-term international remote working as a mechanism to solve talent shortages. It's really interesting that in one of our polls recently, less than 10% of companies that we surveyed actually decided not to include international remote working in their talent strategy. For everybody else, it's a key piece in talent acquisition, talent retention, and skills redeployment. They just want to do it in a controlled and, I guess, an informed way. So I think it's really alive and kicking and is not going to go anywhere soon.
So alive and kicking, pretty dynamic, keeps changing. Michelle, in terms of what you've seen companies do, the ones that have got their heads most around this, what sort of patterns have you been observing?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. There's no sort of one size fits all. So we're seeing companies sort of thinking about their own business objectives, their talent strategy, and what they really need to achieve, in the years to come. And that has an influence over the policies that they're putting in place. So we do have a number of companies that are putting in place short-term remote working policies, allowing them to work for a few days or a few weeks from a different location. But then, as Beth says, we now also have companies that are using this as part of their recruitment strategy, and they're deliberately hiring from abroad in order to expand their talent pool and get the right people in the right jobs. And more recently, we've also seen companies look more to the talent marketplace type approach, where they're potentially matching projects with employees and enabling people to apply for a project for a couple of months that might be in a different location. So you're really getting the business benefits from the project being carried out and the employee benefit from getting to work in a different location. So I think it's a really interesting sort of evolution from employee-driven, as it may have been right after the pandemic, through to really matching business objectives now. I think initially we felt perhaps the regulated industry would struggle to provide flexibility on remote working, and maybe it would be mainly the technology companies or corporates that would offer it. But actually even FS and legal sectors and the more regulated organisations are providing flexibility now. The difference between the different types of organisation is really around what they offer. So which locations you can go to, for how many days, which types of roles might be location agnostic, and a lot of work is going into determining that on a company by company basis, including all the right stakeholders. And I think what is key is how the policies are communicated once they're developed, so that the business and the employees are sort of really fully aware and comfortable with what they are allowed to do.
So there's quite a lot of innovation activity going on in the corporate sector in terms of responding to this. Is there the same degree of innovation and dynamism in the way that international rules, regulations, taxes work, or are they kind of staying fairly static?
Not everywhere, I think that's fair, but we're really seeing some positive signals now, especially regulators and legislators in Europe and beyond, where they have accepted that tax, social security and immigration laws and regulations really need to adapt to this new virtual way of working. And we're actually seeing some action around that. Immigration is a really good point here. I mean, there are 50 or more jurisdictions that now have specific visas that enable flexible international remote work. And that trend is interesting because it started with sort of smaller economies, smaller nations that were tourism dependent. But now we have large economies like Brazil that are offering these remote working visas. Europe is catching up. So Spain, for example, launched a teleworking visa just before Christmas, and now non-EU citizens can work remotely in Spain for up to a year. Another interesting development, I think, is around social security. So social security traditionally is a bit of a blocker to international remote working because your social security liability can change depending on the arrangements. And the EU has now looked at that and is launching a singular framework, which would give an option to cross-border workers that spend some time at home not to trigger that change in social security liability. So we're not seeing it everywhere, so we continue to have to work with clients to put frameworks around remote working so that we manage the compliance risks. But those frameworks are enabling those organisations to say yes more often than not. So definite change afoot. But I guess, Tim, what's your views from a corporate tax perspective?
I would say a bit less change afoot on the corporate tax front. Early on in COVID, a number of tax authorities put in place guidance essentially on the short-term nature of people stuck in the wrong country. But that's very different from having a new international tax system that is able to accommodate remote working or talent hires from wherever. So I think corporate tax maybe has a bit further to go than payroll taxes or than visas as you've described. But given all of this, so given the complexity of the international tax system and all of the different taxes and regulations you've got to think about, given the fact that, Michelle, as you said, one size doesn't fit all, if you're a tax leader, what are the main areas that you should be prioritising and thinking about over the next few months and years?
Yeah, so I think as tax people, we're sort of taught to come and look for the risk, and that's our instinct. But where we've seen success in tax teams and the business working together to develop these policies is where tax sort of come with the list of conditions that they're comfortable accepting. So coming to the table sort of with a structure that you would be comfortable with, that you've sort of thought through, that allows the business to have some flexibility and to attract talent while still really managing your risks. So being part of that collaboration is really key.
Great. And Beth, any addition from you?
Yeah, I agree. I think tax leaders can really be part of breaking down the silos around this issue. So they can be forming industry groups, for example, to engage with local institutions, local policymakers, to try and inform governments around what they need to do to adapt to this new hybrid and remote working arrangements. Because as I said before, I just don't think that they're going to go away anytime soon.
So lots to think about there. I think some pretty clear conclusions out of that. Firstly, remote working is not going away as a phenomenon. It's with us, it's here to stay, and it's going to keep changing. As tax leaders, make sure that you're not just a blocker. So try to make sure that you're coming up with productive and positive ways to engage with the business on this. Make sure you're talking to your colleagues both internally and also engaging externally. See if you can help to influence policy in the way that it's shaped. And keep your eyes on the trends and what's continuing to happen. So thanks a lot, both Michelle and Beth, really interesting conversation.